Hey, good morning, everyone. Always a relief when I hit the go live button and the little "You're live" message pops up. So there's been some days when it hasn't worked the way it's supposed to. So those are always on my mind when we're logging in here. So I'm gonna make fun of myself and apologize to my team here this morning. You've probably learned in your operation at home that communication with your team is vitally important. And if my wife sees this, she's going to be reminding me that she tells me all the time what a horrible communicator I am. And that might surprise a few people that know me at work. I communicate with people for a living. And so you might think that I'm a good communicator. I pride myself on my ability to be able to communicate with people. However, I don't always do it like you're supposed to. So, anyway, 2 weeks ago on Ask the Agronomist, you might remember that producer Jennifer filled in for Adam, and we had a great episode. She was relieved that sitting in the producer chair doesn't require a PhD in agronomy. And she had always been nervous about doing that. And afterwards, she confessed that she enjoyed it, and it really wasn't as difficult as she thought it would be. Adam had been out of town 2 weeks ago, so I actually kind of thought that she was planning on kicking Adam out of the producer's chair and driving the bus from here on. And generally, when Jennifer is running things, we meet in Monmouth because that's close to her family and other things that work more convenient for her. So, unbeknownst to Adam and Jennifer, I had been assuming that Jennifer and I were going to do Ask the Agronomist this morning from Monmouth. So I get to the location that we do it with at Monmouth here at Elliott Brothers Seed, and nobody's here. Lights are on. Place is unlocked. I'm thinking, okay, well, Jennifer's probably out and about doing things. She'll be here in a minute. So about the time I'm getting ready to text her, I get a text from her and Adam that they're in Macomb at Yetter Manufacturing, which is where we historically have done more of our Ask the Agronomist episodes from. So we had a bit of a collective, oh, you know what moment there. So anyway, I'm flying solo here at the moment from Elliott Brothers Seed in Monmouth. Adam is going back home to get some real work done today, and I've wasted an hour plus of very valuable FSR time this morning. So if you're in Adam's territory and he canceled an appointment with you this morning because he had to do Ask the Agronomist, my bad. And then also Jennifer is probably, if there's any police listening, probably speeding up Highway 67 right now on her way to join me in progress here in Monmouth. So anyway, with that, I have a list of topics here. When Jennifer gets here, she'll get logged on. She'll be able to monitor the chat. So please. Go ahead and live chat your questions in. When Jennifer gets here, she'll be able to check them. We've actually had some really good questions that have come in since last week. One of them from a grower of hers that had a good question on nitrogen. So, and I had a couple phone calls yesterday, one related to nitrogen, one related to soybeans popping out of their pods, unfortunately, which kind of would be the soybean version of down corn. And so a lot of these soybeans that we've let go to last, on my farm included, are possibly in need of being rescued quickly as well, just like our corn has been really all fall. So seems like there's never a perfect solution. If you did soybeans, you're fighting down corn. If you did corn before it fell down, now you're fighting harvesting soybeans in November. And possibly facing yield losses in your soybeans from them falling out of the pods before you're able to harvest them. So, but we'll go ahead and kick it off with Jennifer's grower's good nitrogen question. So his question was he wants to do some fall, not chiseling, but like a low disturbance deep ripper, like a. Not to throw out brand names, but like a Blue Jet type tool or a Rawson zone type tool. Fairly low surface disturbance, not bearing a lot of residue, not really flipping things over, just pulling that deep shank ripper knife through the soil before he does his anhydrous. So, there's really, trade-offs there. Some guys that like to do some tillage in the fall want to get it done, want to let that soil kind of settle, and then do the anhydrous. That's challenging in other ways. In some cases, it makes the field kind of rough, depending on what type of tillage you're going to do. In other cases, it a little bit defeats the purpose of doing the tillage and then tracking the field up while you're putting on anhydrous. If you do the anhydrous first, then you're going to have to wait a period of time. I'd like to see at least 2 weeks before you do any deep tillage in that field. So this gentleman's question was, well, what if I do the deep ripper first and then put the anhydrous on? So a couple thoughts. You are going to create some air pockets in that soil where that ripper shank runs. And if that anhydrous knife is laying down anhydrous in that air pocket created by that ripper, I do think there is some potential for loss. Now, you could probably reduce the potential by deepening your anhydrous application a little bit. And if the soil at the surface is crumbling really nice and you've got some good cover boards on that toolbar and you're pulling a nice berm back over that row, even if you don't have perfect soil contact down there where you're applying that anhydrous, probably you're going to keep most of that in the soil. Basically, you need soil contact for that anhydrous to stabilize. And you don't really want free anhydrous trapped in the soil that's unable to have good soil contact. And sometimes when we put anhydrous on when it's really wet and things smear and don't seal good, we can have situations where we can lose some of that nitrogen, at the time of application. Lots of ways to lose nitrogen. You can lose it at the time of application. You can lose it 6 months later. You can lose it a month later. Really what we're trying to do with our nitrogen is minimize our opportunities for loss. And, when you're applying in the fall in less than ideal conditions, that creates an opportunity for loss, at the time of application. And then on top of that loss, you can still have your spring loss, your summer loss. And, we're just trying to minimize those losses to make sure we have ample amount of nitrogen for the crop. So, to more directly answer Jennifer's customer's question, I think you can probably do it. I don't think your chances of loss will be great. It's not ideal. One idea that I gave to Jennifer, she might have shared this with you, I don't know. If your planning ons probably won't work because most people don't do either of those operations straight. But if you are using guidance, it would be totally possible to run your ripper on whatever angle you want to run it or run it straight and apply your anhydrous parallel to on basically shift over 15 inches on the same AB line. And if your anhydrous toolbar is operating in between where your ripper shanks ran, then I would see no problem at all. If you are not using guidance, occasionally that anhydrous toolbar is going to cross the track that the ripper made. Worst case scenario you would be following down the same track for some distance. If you crisscross them in some way, periodically the the anhydrous knife track is going to cross the ripper shank. So where those intersections occur, that's where you're going to have some potential loss. So if you figure the intersection points represent 10% of the field, and you figure you lose 50% of your nitrogen in 10% of your field, you're losing 5% of your nitrogen. So it's never good to lose any nitrogen. Your chances of losing a lot of nitrogen doing what you had asked Jennifer about, I think are pretty low. but it's a judgment call. Probably be okay. The better the conditions are when you apply the anhydrous. So if surface soil conditions are perfect when anhydrous is going on and everything's working really nice above ground, that's going to help what might be an issue below ground. So those are my thoughts on that subject. Other things that have come up related to nitrogen. Another phone call that I had yesterday was a producer called with a good question. As you're evaluating your fertilizer budget for next year, kind of a depressing thing for most producers. Nitrogen costs are up dramatically. P&K costs are up dramatically. I think I just saw Jennifer's truck pull in. So we'll be joined by Miss Jennifer here shortly. And she absolutely was speeding because she got to Monmouth really fast. But anyway, don't tell her boss. So anyway, nitrogen budgets. So anhydrous is up significantly. UAN probably going to be up proportionately even more than nitrogen. And it's a really kind of an unknown right now what nitrogen is even going to cost in the spring. You can get a price on fall ammonia. You might be able to get a price on spring ammonia. If you get one, you're not going to like it. It's even harder to get a price on spring UAN. So this grower's question was he typically does some fall anhydrous and some UAN pre-plant, and he is considering doing less UAN in the spring and applying more of his nitrogen as anhydrous. And his question was, how much can I cut my spring UAN rate back and still be a benefit? So there's two ways to look at that. One way is the amount of UAN you use in the spring is part of your total nitrogen budget. So let's say you want to put on 180 units of actual nitrogen, for your corn crop. And let's say you're doing some fall, let's say you're doing some spring, let's say you're doing some side dress. You want to add those three applications, you want to add up to your total nitrogen budget of 180 units. I'm just picking an arbitrary number. You might be using less, you might be using more. 180 is not always the right rate, just the one I picked. So let's say in this grower's, let's say typically he's been doing 120 in the fall as anhydrous and putting on 60 units in the spring as UAN, as a weed and feed, pre-plant UAN application. So you could cut that UAN rate back. You could cut it out completely, put on 180 in the fall. You could reduce it by half. You could put on 150 in the fall and 30 in the spring to reach your 180 goal. So you're still applying 180 units of nitrogen. You're not using less total nitrogen. And in theory, as long as you've got enough nitrogen out there, when the crop needs it, it doesn't always matter when you applied it. So in that scenario, you would be saving some money by shifting more of that nitrogen into the fall application. Now, if you're not a huge fan of fall applied nitrogen, that might seem risky to you, putting more of your eggs in the fall applied basket. But if that's a cheaper basket to put them in, you got to weigh that trade-off. The other thing to consider, and this is, I think, maybe more important, is the benefit of having a readily available nitrogen source to those young corn plants soon after emergence in the spring. So even if you put on 300 units of anhydrous in the fall, or of nitrogen as anhydrous in the fall, that plant, when it's just getting going in the spring, isn't even going to know that nitrogen is there. However, if you apply UAN in the spring, it's absolutely going to know that nitrogen's there because it's going to be readily available to that plant. It's going to be in closer proximity to the roots of that young plant. And as that young plant is getting established, it's going to have better access to that spring applied UAN than it does to that fall applied anhydrous. This is even more critical in a corn on corn situation, because in a corn on corn situation, that plant basically has no nitrogen available to it unless you put on something in the spring that's readily available, because the anhydrous that's down deep, until the roots get to it, is really going to be of no benefit to that young corn plant. And if you're in a corn on corn situation, the soil microbial biomass that's breaking down that high carbon corn residue is going to tie up all of the readily available nitrogen from the soil. Good morning, Jennifer.
I want to clarify if Eric Curry's on the phone.
Yeah.
I was not speeding. That's my dad's vehicle.
I've already told the world you had to be speeding because you got here fast.
That.
Okay. Oh, so you're not only speeding, you're watching the video while you're driving. Naughty, naughty. Okay, so a little bit of fun at Jennifer's expense, all my fault, as I've already explained. So anyway, back to our nitrogen management question. So I do think it is risky if you're typically applying some UAN pre-plant to pull that out to save money, because I do think you could potentially starve your crop for nitrogen early in the season. And we do know that if a crop is starved for nitrogen early in the season, it can get conservative as it's setting its yield potential. And you can't get that yield potential back once that plant has sensed it's in a nitrogen limiting environment. And a plant can sense, do I have plenty of nitrogen or is nitrogen short? And if nitrogen is short, it starts getting defensive. You don't want that plant to get defensive. You want it to stay offensive. You want to set as much yield potential as possible, and giving it plenty of available nitrogen early in the season is the best way to do that. So my grower's direct question was, how little N can I apply as UAN and still get a benefit? That number for me is 30 units. I would like to see more in a corn on corn situation. 45 is my minimum number. I prefer 60. And in a soybean, rotated situation, if you're not willing to put on 30 units, I'd say you could probably skip it. Once you get below 30 units, if you look at 30, unless you have some way to band it, if you're putting it on through the planter, or you've got some way to direct it right above the row, like if you've got a sprayer set up with banding nozzles or something like that, you could use less than 30 units if you can keep it close to the row. So that would be the benefit of a row starter system on a planter or some sort of banding nozzle. But if you're broadcasting, which is the way most of it gets applied because it's being applied as a carrier with your herbicide, I wouldn't recommend going below 30 units for that spring UAN application. If you've been using more than that, maybe you could cut that back and shift more into your fall anhydrous and save a little bit of money from your nitrogen budget. But just be aware that if you're using fall anhydrous for 100% of your nitrogen program, your corn plants are going to be a little bit starved for nitrogen early in the season, especially if it's corn on corn. Spring anhydrous applications are even worse for that, because that spring ammonia, the fall applied ammonia, a lot of it in the spring is in a plant available form. It's just at a depth that the plant roots have to grow down to. Spring anhydrous is not in a plant available form for quite a while after application. So not only is it inaccessible from a depth standpoint, it's inaccessible from a usable form standpoint. So year in and year out, the ugliest fields I see early in the spring are spring applied anhydrous on corn fields that do not get a good amount of UAN applied at planting time. Those fields really, really suffer from a lack of nitrogen early in the season. That may or may not impact the final yield of the field. You never know. But you don't really want that plant to be short of nitrogen or perceive that it's short of nitrogen early in the season, because that just causes it to get conservative and set a smaller potential ear than it otherwise would have. So with Jennifer here now and monitoring the chat, and she had some stuff prepared. And she was very prepared for today too. She had all kinds of stuff ready to go. And then I sabotaged her plans by not telling her where we were going to be. So I apologize, Miss Jennifer.
It's okay.
But anyway, as you want to chat your questions in, just a reminder, if you would like to chat in, you do need to be logged on with either a YouTube account. If you don't have a YouTube account, I'd encourage you to make one. It's easy. Even I was able to do that. Or you can just be logged on with like a Gmail or any Google email account, and then you'll be able to chat in those questions. In the live chat, you can text a question to your FSR, to Jennifer, or any other FSRs who might be watching this morning. You can text one to me, but I'm probably not going to see it while we're live on the air. But I do kind of keep the good questions that I get over the next 2 weeks, and we can incorporate that into a future Ask the Agronomist episode. Please email me as well. I don't have a board to write my email address on here. If I was at the right location, I would have it written on the board behind me. But Jennifer can put my email in the chat, and I do get some good questions emailed to me. That reminds me, I got a good question emailed to me a couple weeks ago, which I apologize I have not answered yet, and this will be something we talk about on a future episode. The question was, do we have data to support, or can we verify what impact the low light levels that we experienced at certain times through the summer had on the corn crop? And that is a really good conversation. We've touched on that a little bit in some previous episodes. I've speculated that was an issue. I haven't had time to really dig into the data to see if we can find data to support that was an issue. But, in my opinion, when it's cloudy because it's rainy, or hazy because it's smoky, and we're losing sunlight in July and August, that's not a good time to be losing sunlight. So I certainly think that there is a possibility that low light levels on certain days, reducing the photosynthetic efficiency of the plant, reducing its ability to feed itself and produce sugars to fill the ear, could have been an additional stress on the plant on top of all the other numerous stresses that we've talked about, from diseases and dry weather and hot nights and all the other things that we know the corn crop went through during grain fill. So not really answering the question, but just kind of putting it out there as a teaser that would be a good topic to dig into on a later date. So while we're a little bit on the nitrogen fertilizer conversation, I'll talk a little bit about dry fertilizer. If you're looking for strategies to improve your efficiency on your dry fertilizer, a good place to start is soil testing. So if you don't have a current, within the last 4 years soil test, and you're wondering, what's it going to hurt to skip a year or put on a little less fertilizer than normal, you really kind of need to know where you're at to make a good decision there. So it might be, to me, when fertilizer is expensive, I know it sucks to spend more money when you're trying to save money, but relative to the cost of fertilizer, soil tests are extremely cheap. So I would not skimp on soil testing as a way to save money on fertilizer. When fertilizer is expensive, I would make the argument you need to spend more money on soil testing so that you know where you're at, so that you're not wasting the expensive product. So get some new soil tests if you need them. pH is big with me. So the cost of lime and application is probably up as well, but proportionately, it's not up near as much as N, P, and K. And if your pH is out of whack, that really affects the availability of a lot of nutrients. And so to me, getting your pH right is kind of the low-hanging fruit. So if you really don't want to spend what it's going to cost to apply what you normally apply, you might be better off to spend some of that budget on lime and get your pH right. So soil testing, pH be the place to start. If you've been a 200 spread kind of person, and you're just been doing that every year because that's what you do, we need to look at yields. We need to look at soil tests. We need to look at other factors. Maybe we consider going to an annual application. That's something that I like. That's something I've done for years. There's data to support that annual applications of fertilizer are more efficient. You get less soil tie-up. You can be a little more precise with your fertilizer, especially if you're doing it the way I like to do it, and you're using the removal yield application method, where you're using your yield data to build a script to apply nutrients based on what your crop actually yielded. So on my farms, those good spots that were pumping out 280 bushel of corn, I'm going to be spending a crap load of money on fertilizer, putting back 280 bushels worth of P&K removal along with sulfur. Over here, where the field yielded 50 because it was replant corn in a pond, and oh, by the way, that spot always yields poorly because it's a pond, and I'm never removing very much fertilizer, my soil tests probably indicate I don't need any there at all. And so you might put on 0 there because you've got plenty. Or if you only put on the amount that 50 bushels of crappy corn removed, you're not going to spend much money on fertilizer in those areas. So doing that removal rate spreading application is an option. Good morning, Mr. Elliott. You don't have to be quiet. We're all family here. So the other thing that I'm very comfortable with is I look at soil test levels kind of like having money in a savings account. And if you've got money in your savings account, it's okay to make a withdrawal. So if you've got good soil test levels, it's not the end of the world to put on a lesser amount than you normally do, or heaven forbid, maybe even generate a script. I do this on my own farm. I generate scripts that the application rate is 0. So if I've got sky high fertility, I've got some farms that have had a history of manure, or if you've got an area in a field that has always been low producing and for years and years and years, it was getting over fertilized by just putting on a flat rate. There's some wet areas and fields that have got enough P&K for the next 20 years already sitting there in the soil because forever and ever and ever and ever, we've been over fertilizing that part of the field because it's getting the same amount of fertilizer as the rest of the field, but it's not producing much. So if you can identify areas like that have very high levels of soil fertility, absolutely okay to not apply any there. So if you haven't done soil testing, if you haven't looked at variable rate scripts, if you haven't considered applying based on yield removal, if you haven't considered applying annually instead of every other year, those are all things that you can look into. That might be some ways there that you can save a few dollars without impacting your yield. That's really the trick with anything we try to save money on in production agriculture is as soon as we save money and reduce yield, we probably lost money. If we save money, morning, Mr. Chandler. This is the problem with not telling people what I'm doing is because people make plans to use their facilities and then some dumb agronomist is on a video here and it makes them feel uncomfortable. So I'm sorry, guys. Good morning. So some good customers here with Mr. Elliott this morning, actually using his place of business because I didn't tell anybody that I was planning on doing Ask the Agronomist from here. So this is the gift that just keeps giving, Jennifer. So anyway, I love having fun at my own expense. I hope you all do as well. So that's probably enough time spent on fertility, but on my own operation at home, I've made the arbitrary decision. I'm going to do 3/4 removal. So I am going to make somewhat of withdrawal from my bank account. Now, if you get some soil tests and your soil tests say your bank account's empty, well, then you can't withdraw from an empty account. But if your soil tests say that you've got plenty of fertility in the soil to where, in theory, applying fertilizer is not going to increase your yield. Long term, we may have to make that application up to maintain our soil test levels, but there's going to be years in the future where it would be more economical to, the other thing I've been telling guys, I don't think this is a year to be worried about building the soil fertility level. In some cases, we maybe need to try to maintain. In other cases, it's okay if we mine a little bit. We don't need to be trying to build anything in the market that we're in currently. So let's touch on fall burn down a little bit. So we've had some hard freezes, which I know some of you are thankful for because this is going to smoke the commodity cover crop that you've had growing in your fields and make people feel a little bit better. And You might wonder, well, since we've had a hard freeze, is it too late to do fall burn down? Can I still do fall burn down? And actually, fall burn downs after a freeze work wonderfully well. You don't necessarily want to run out there the morning that it's 25 degrees and be making that application. But the winter annual weeds that we're trying to control in a fall burn down, things like henbit, chickweed, shepherd's purse, pennycress, there's some winter annual grasses as well. Those species all live quite long into the fall, and a couple hard frosts or even freezes is not going to make those plants go dormant. And in plots and in trials, I've sprayed fall burn downs well past Christmas. And as long as you've got a day that's 40 degrees plus and relatively good growing conditions, we say we want actively growing weeds. Well, these winter annual weed species are actively growing weeds when it's 40, 45, 50 degrees. So you might think, based on experience you've had trying to kill, water hemp or giant ragweed or lamb squirters or velvet leaf or some tough broadleaf, and it's been a cool day or not a good day, you get poor control sometimes. With the fall burn downs, things are just easier to kill in the fall. There's something about that plant kind of knows that it's going into winter. It's trying to store up reserves in the roots, and so that means everything you put on that plant is going to get translocated into the root. If it's a translocatable product like a glyphosate, which we're not using much glyphosate this year in fall burn downs, we're using other products to kind of save the glyphosate for next summer. But typically things are far easier to kill in the fall, and even if it's been cold, I am a little bit concerned that we've had we've gotten off to a little bit of a shaky start with our fall work because of the weather. The next 10 days looks really good on the forecast I looked at yesterday. So hopefully we're going to be able to catch up with finish harvest, have some good windows here to get fall anhydrous on, have some good windows to get fall fertilizer on, have good windows to get fall burn down on, have good windows to get fall tillage done. It's November 4th, and a lot of people probably are by their standards behind on their work here in the fall. So hopefully we have a nice open fall and we can get all this work that we ideally want to do in the fall, get it all done. But don't forget those fall burn downs. Don't forget how badly you wished you'd done a fall burn down back in April and May of this year. That's typically what happens. We skip the fall burn down in the fall, and then the following spring, it's like, man, I wish I'd done that fall burn down. I don't like looking at these green fields. I don't like all the cutworm moths that I'm attracting into my fields. I don't like how it plants going through all this stuff. And we're determined at planting season every year to do a fall burn down because we are looking back in hindsight going, I should have done one last fall. Well, then this fall rolls around, we get busy, we're doing anhydrous, we're doing fertilizer, we're trying to save money. You look at that field in the fall and, yeah, there's a little bit of stuff out there, but it doesn't look that bad. That won't be that bad by spring. I'll just skip it again. And then next spring, we start the whole process all over again. So I've got quite a bit of fall burn down on my operation, hoping to do a lot more. And it does give you more flexibility for your in-season herbicide program next year. If you don't absolutely have to have a burn down at planting, it gives you the option to just go plant and then maybe come in after you've planted with your residual program. Maybe you need a spring burn down. Maybe you won't need a spring burn down. Maybe you can get by without the spring burn down. But regardless of whether you need a spring burn down or not, it's not going to be quite as time sensitive. It's not going to be quite as critical. You're not going to have quite as much stuff to try to take out with that spring burn down. So that fall burn down is really a nice tool. And with something like mare's tail, to be honest, mare's tail is very, if you're not using dicamba in your spring pass, which I highly encourage, but if you're not, it's almost impossible to kill mare's tail unless you take it out in the fall. So if you're a no-tiller like I am and you have a lot of mare's tail and you're not planning on using dicamba in your spring burn down, I would highly, highly, highly encourage you to get that mare's tail controlled this fall, because it is just, you've got so many more options, so many more effective options, and you're going to be a lot happier with your control if you get most of that mare's tail taken out. Probably 85 or 90% of the mare's tail that are going to be in your field next spring and summer are already there in your field in a rosette stage, just a real small plant right now. Very easy to control right now, but after it goes through the winter and when it starts to come back in the spring, especially once it gets any size to it in the spring, becomes very, very, very difficult to control. So I'll get off my fall burn down soapbox and talk about something that producer Adam really wanted us to spend some time on, and that is making heads or tails of the wacky growing season that we had in 2021. And I think I always like to remind people when we have an odd growing season, I like to remind people that every year is different. I've talked to farmers that, this was their 50th crop this year, and they can never recall seeing a year like 2021. So if you've been farming for 50 years and you've never seen a year like this, why would you assume that next year would be like this? Next year's going to be different. Hopefully for some people, next year is better. For some people, next year could be worse. We don't know what next year is going to be like, but the one thing we do know about next year is it'll be different than this year was. So a lot of times we chase our tail because we want to do next year what we should have done this year. So typically that doesn't work as good as you would like it to, because next year is going to be different. And one of the things that I think illustrates maybe better than most how odd and unique this environment was is the number of people that have told me that on their farm, the same hybrid, managed the same way, maybe planted on the same day or a day apart, maybe on farms that weren't very far apart, was their best corn and their worst corn. And I see producer Jennifer nodding her head over here. She's had people tell her that as well. And, typically this time of year, we're pouring through data, you're looking at plots, you're looking at your farm results, you're looking for the trends, you're looking for the products that are consistently rising to the top. And what do you want to do? You want to plant more acres to those, and you want to get rid of the ones or reduce how much you planted the ones that you were a little disappointed in. And we do that every year, and seed companies do that as well. Our breeders are doing that right now. The breeders are pouring through this year's breeder plot data. They're looking for the stuff that was better. When we turn in our crop plan for what we want to have available to you to sell for 2023, and I guarantee you products that struggled in 2021, that's going to be in the back of our mind. And we're going to think, well, you're not going to want much of that next year. So we won't ask for much of that for 2023. And then when they come roaring back in 22 and have an awesome year and you want to plant more of them, we're like, sorry, we didn't grow any. So we are subject to the same reactions and overreactions that you are. And, it doesn't matter whether it's DeKalb or any other seed company, there's just some weird hybrids that are doing well this year. And there's some really good germplasm that in some cases has struggled this year. And so the question before us today as a seed company is, okay, do we ramp up production of the stuff that was good in 21? Or do we take 21 with a grain of salt, look at 3 or 4 or 5 years of data, not just 1 year of data, and do we make a more rational decision to, okay, maybe there's places we ought to be using some of these products that were good in 21, but if we've looked at a hybrid for 5 years in thousands of trials, and the first year it impressed anybody was 21, that's not a bandwagon I want to be jumping on. I would probably rather stay with the one that had been awesome the previous 4 years that struggled in 21. So I think it's going to be really hard not to overreact to what just happened. And I know it's really hard to not make decisions based off what you saw on your farm. But take into consideration the fact that if you saw the same hybrid on your farm in the same year with similar management be both awesome and disappointing, how are you going to process that information? The other thing I see quite commonly is farmer A thinks product B is awesome. Farmer B thinks product B sucks based on his experience. They're actually probably both wrong. The guy that thinks it's awesome, it's probably not as good as he thinks it is. The guy that thinks it's horrible, it's probably not as horrible as he thinks it is. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. But our perception of products is so heavily skewed by what we see on our own farm, what we see in plots, what we see in data, what we hear from other people. And it is a very, very, very difficult year, maybe the most difficult I've ever seen, to make heads or tails out of product performance. And the more growers I talk to and the more people that share with me, I've had the same hybrid, can't figure out what's the difference between these two fields. It made 260 and was standing here, and it made 180 and was going down bad over here. They both got fungicide. They got planted, within 24 hours of each other. They usually yield about the same. The fields are only 3 miles apart. They were both first-year corn. What was the difference? It was probably related to disease. In many cases, probably crown rot was probably influencing that. I'll also, a little bit of foreshadowing here. My colleague, Chris Carlisle, is working on summarizing his crown rot data from his trials this year. And in an upcoming episode, I won't promise which one, but in an upcoming episode of Ask the Agronomist, I may try to have Chris with me. I don't feel good about, I don't want to take credit for his work. So I would rather have him with me on Ask the Agronomist to discuss the results of his crown rot trials. But that'll be coming in an upcoming episode. But generally speaking, when you see things that perform very, very different, and it's the same product with the same management. So if the product's the same, the management's the same, what changed was the environment. We can't always determine what about the environment was so different, because to us, we're not as sensitive as the plant that's growing in that environment. To us, the environment didn't seem that different. But if you've got an 80 bushel swing in yield and the difference between standing corn and down corn, that tells me that plant could tell there was a difference. What the difference was, we may never know. But if you make a decision on your opinion of that hybrid based on the good field, you're feeling really good. If you make a decision on that hybrid based on the bad field, you're feeling pretty crappy. And the reality is probably generally somewhere in the middle. So I think, as you're evaluating performance on the farm, as you're talking to your suppliers, my coaching would be, if you've had good performance with something in the past and it struggled this year, find out, is there something we can, if 22 in any way, shape, or form looks like 21, we learned a lot of things in 21. The next time a year like this comes around, we'll be more prepared to deal with it. So I'm more comfortable based on what we've learned, going back to the well on some products that maybe you were a little bit disappointed in. If you saw something that you think you liked, and we've got multiple years of data that says that's a solid product, no harm in using more of that. If you saw something you liked and you talk to your seed supplier and they go, well, the past 3 years we've looked at it and it's been a below average hybrid, that's one I think I'd be cautious with. And the other thing I'll warn you about, not just for DeKalb, but for all seed companies, typically speaking, if something did surprisingly well and they weren't expecting it to be that good, they're not going to have a lot of supply. So we tend to have good supply of the things we thought were going to be good, and we try to have no supply of the things we don't think are that good. So when surprises happen in the seed business, there's almost always a supply component to the surprise, because the fact that it was a surprise indicates that probably didn't produce a lot of that product that was better than we expected it to be. So Jennifer,
Yeah,
question.
you're, once again, famous line of ATA, let's not make this a commercial.
Mhm.
But can you just discuss a little bit about RM and how that looks in our company and how we identify that in our hybrids?
Yeah.
And also talk about too, I get stuck with a lot of customers that says, well, I'm not willing to go outside of a 112
Yeah.
or a 115, but
Yep.
they're missing out on a great 116
Yep.
product. So can you talk about how to be flexible on that and how to really interpret that information as far as maturity goes?
Yep. So good question. I had the same conversation with the grower the other day. He only wants to plant between a 110 and a 113.
Yep.
I mean, that's a pretty tight range. And when you plant a narrow range of maturities, about everything's going to need harvested at the same time. And I think 21 in particular, again, I just told you not to pay much attention to 21. Here I am talking about 21. So see, I'm guilty as well. This year in particular, having a wide range of maturity was a nice thing because we needed to start early and we needed to have some full season corn that had a little better health to it that didn't fall apart so that you had time to get there. So I generally recommend if you've got 1,000 acres or more of corn to harvest, I would consider a 10-day spread in relative maturity. And that's probably larger than most people do. Some guys don't mind having some early corn. And when I say early, I'm going to say sub 108 would be early for most of our geography. So we've got some good 104, 105, 106, 107-day corn. That's earlier than a lot of people want to plant because there's a perception that you're going to give up too much yield planting early corn. And there are reasons why people feel that way. The other way you can go, we've got a very good 120-day hybrid that is very popular with some people. I've grown it myself on my farm and have had great success with it. But most people, have a mental block that, to Jennifer's point, I can't go past a 114. Well, you can. You just maybe don't want to, or maybe you never have, or maybe you did once and had a bad experience. But I assure you, we plant a lot of plots late every year. Sometimes the plot's the last thing the guy plants. I planted a plot at Monmouth June 5th, I believe, when we got that demo plot in. We planted 70-27, which is our 120-day double pro at Monmouth on June 5th. Nobody would ever do that, but we did it in a plot and it was fine. I mean, yeah, it's going to be wetter. But, if you save it to last, typically those full season hybrids are not going to be any wetter harvested last than your early corn was when you started. And ideally, if you like to harvest 20% corn and you want to harvest 20% corn all fall, you can do that if you put a big enough spread of maturity in your hybrids. Now, part of Adam's question was, does everybody number their hybrids the same? And no, they don't. If you want to look at growing degree units to black layer, GDUs to black layer, that will give you a better indication of the true maturity of a product. But to be quite honest with you, a lot of people are probably not, tracking perfectly accurately when that product actually reaches black layer in plots. So most of us kind of have most companies have a scale, and say 114-day hybrid, we're going to say it's got 2,800 heat units to black layer. Let's just say I didn't look that up, but that's close. Do people do a lot of trials to actually measure, how many heat units something has arrived at when it black layers? Probably not. They've got their own internal scale that they use, and everybody's internal scale is different. So typically, if we say a product is 112-day hybrid, it's going to pollinate later and black layer later at a higher growing degree unit than what we say 108 or 110-day hybrid would do. But there is no cross-brand consistency. So, a 112-day DeKalb doesn't have to be the same as 112-day anything else. And somebody else's 112-day doesn't have to match our 112-day. So there are, trends and tendencies. There are brands that tend to be, we would say later than what they're labeled. There are brands, there's some people that feel our hybrids are earlier than what they are labeled based on their perspective, based on some other brand being different. So you really can't necessarily use what a seed company says the relative maturity of a hybrid is to compare across brands. And in some cases, the RRM of a hybrid doesn't really tell you what the harvest moisture is going to be, because some hybrids dry down fast, some hybrids dry down slow. So the relative maturity within a brand is based on, heat units to black layer. And typically, there's some cases where this has probably been done, but typically you ought to not mess with the maturity rating based on how dry it's going to be at harvest. Now you can do that. So if you've got a dry 114, you could call it a 112. If you got a wet 112, you could call it a 115. People tend to correlate maturity to moisture. And there is a correlation between maturity and moisture, but it's not always perfect. We can have a 109 day that's wetter than 111. And it's not that they're labeled wrong. It's just that if you've got a slow dry down 109 and a fast dry down 111, the 111 will be drier at harvest than the 109. That doesn't mean that they're labeled wrong. It just means that there's more to relative maturity than just harvest moisture. And there are differences in the scale, and there is no industry standard on how many heat units to black layer a 111-day hybrid has to be. So anything else, Jennifer?
Yeah, we've got a flood of questions coming in from my fellow FSRs.
Okay.
I will give the caveat, we've only got 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So people send your questions in, as Lance mentioned early on. We'll cover them the next one.
Yep.
If we can make Adam's question brief, I think Chris Bachman's got a really good timely one.
Yep.
So Adam's real quick question was, what's the ideal moisture to harvest corn?
Okay.
And option for, and obviously it matters what your system and setup is.
Right. So, again, it depends.
Yeah.
Yield wise, 23 and above. There's a lot of data to support that, above 23% is going to maximize your yield. You've got less harvest loss. You've got the plant intactness is still really good at that point in time. So the drier it gets, the less it's going to yield. There's a lot of people that witness that every year. We've talked about phantom yield loss before. We're not going to go down that bunny trail here today. But, typically as corn gets drier than 23% in the field, it starts to yield less. The drier it gets, the more the yield penalty is. The offset is you've got less drying cost. So if your drying costs are high, you're probably better off to give up some yield and harvest drier corn. If your drying costs are low and the value of your crop is high, then you're a lot better off to pay more drying and get the more bushels. So that's how I would answer the question quickly.
Perfect.
What was Bachman's better question?
Bachman's question was in relation to a comment you made at the very beginning about bean popping. And
Yes.
his question is whether you harvest it now or do you wait for stuff to dry down?
Yep. Yeah, he probably had the same conversation with the same person yesterday that I did. So I was actually harvesting beans yesterday that were wetter than I wanted them to be. Not looking forward to getting that settlement sheet and seeing what it costs to deliver 16.5% soybeans to the river. But I sent a couple of loads of 16.5% soybeans to the river yesterday. Now the beans I was in yesterday, the only place I saw beans that were popping out of the pods before the combine even got there. So behind the combine, the beans all over the ground, because as soon as the reel hits them, as soon as the cutter bar hits them, a lot more shatter. These fields would have yielded more a month ago than they are today, I'm sure. But the only areas in my fields I saw beans on the ground already before the combine even got there were the low wet areas. And in those areas, those short little stunted beans that are only about 8 inches tall after the leaves and petioles fell off of them, in areas that I know were damaged by water, the lot of seeds, if you look at them, you look at the plant and you can see the seeds through the pod because the pod has split open. In some cases, there's kind of a twist to it. The seed's still kind of hanging in there, but the pod's already open. And some of the seeds have fallen out. You can imagine with those pods already kind of being split and partially open, as soon as you touch them, there's just beans going everywhere. And the individual that I talked to yesterday, he had a great analogy, and I've heard this before, and it's a sickening sound. He said, if you're standing in a field shut your truck off, everything's quiet, and just stand there. You can hear soybeans falling out of the pods. It sounded like Rice Krispies in a field. And that's a good image. It's a bad image, but a good imagery, I guess. But and I've heard that before a couple times, and it is disgusting. So his scenario was he's seeing that, hearing that, experiencing that. His beans were 18%. So a lot of elevators won't even take 18% beans. So that's the first thing. So first thing to determine is, will your market accept beans that wet? And if they will, can you accept what it's going to cost you to deliver beans that wet? Now, with the weather we've got coming, they're not going to be that wet very long. So the question is, do I wait a couple days and let them get closer to a harvestable moisture? How many more of them are going to fall on the ground while I'm waiting for that? And if I lose another 5 or 10 bushel yield, that's worth way more than what the moisture dock's going to cost me. So in that scenario, you would be better off to go get them at whatever moisture they are. If you've got a bin that you can throw them in and turn on a big fan and maybe blow some air on them this fall, maybe take 2 or 3 points of moisture out of them before January when you've got to deliver them, that might be the best case scenario. But if you don't have a bin available, or you don't have one with a big enough fan to dry soybeans, you're not set up to do that. You've got 1,000 acres of beans to harvest, and the quickest way to get them out is just send them to town. I get that. I could have hauled my 16.5% beans to a bin that wasn't really set up to use, but it was going to slow us down. It was going to be a hassle. I was being lazy. It's like, I'd rather pay the dock. So that's what I did. But I'm not seeing the soybeans popping out of the pods widely. But the individual I was talking to yesterday in Tazewell County, he went to several fields and felt he was seeing the same thing in several fields to varying degrees. So I do think it would be good to go look. It is what it is. We can only harvest these beans as fast as we can get to them. Yesterday, we started at 1 o'clock. Beans were over 16 at 1 o'clock. By 6 in the afternoon, they were down to 14. So they had dried over 2 points through the afternoon, but they were still above 13. When we quit at 9:30 last night, it was so tough. I was down to 2 mile an hour. I'd slugged my feeder house 3 times. I was being really mean to my combine. The beans were still testing 13.8. So the grain itself was drier at 9 o'clock last night than it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because of these heavy frosts and freezes. We get a few more, a couple more of these cold nights out of the way. We're gonna, if we only get down to 40 at night, we'll have some really good looking bean cutting days next week. And it's always a judgment call. Should you, it's just like waiting to harvest corn that could fall down. If it doesn't fall down, it was a good idea to wait. If soybeans don't pop out of the pods and the weather forecast doesn't change dramatically, and we can cut 12.5 or 13.5% beans all week next week, then I shouldn't be cutting any 16% beans today. But if you've got enough acres to get done, we don't know what the future holds. It's always there's so many things in agronomy that, well, should I do it or should I wait? Should I plant corn ahead of the cold rain that's coming? Should I plant corn when it's a little marginal? Should I not? Should I harvest high moisture corn and dry it, or should I let it stand in the field? There's all these things that, you can play different scenarios, and you can create a scenario that makes you look like a genius. You can create a scenario that makes you look kind of foolish, and we just don't know. But I've got enough acres left to harvest. I've got on my own operation, we're not terribly efficient. We don't get as much work done as most of you do. I got about 10 good days of bean cutting left. And I don't know how long I'm going to have to wait to get 10 good days. So I've cut beans on 2 days that weren't really good. They were good enough. But, I'm still going to have a lot of beans left to cut next week. So, I'm starting on the early side, kind of pushing things a little bit. I personally decided that was the right thing to do. if we had 2 weeks of beautiful weather and I could have waited 4 days to start and cut all my beans at 13% and not had any moisture dock, that would have been smarter. But I don't know whether that's, reality or not. So we're probably coming up close on time here. Any other questions, Jennifer, that we should squeeze in here at the end? So that I got through most of my list. So please send in your questions. Send your thoughts to your FSR, your dealer, directly to me if you want. I love getting emails from people that they send me an email loaded with really good questions. I'd rather get them live chatted in during Ask the Agronomist, but send them to me in an email. We can address them in a future episode. 2 weeks from today will be what?
November 18th.
November 18th, getting close to Thanksgiving, one of my favorite holidays. I seem to like holidays that are associated with food, Jennifer. I don't know why that is, but I do. So anyway, everybody, please be safe. I know Jennifer's family had a near tragedy here recently with an accident involving a tractor on the road and a vehicle, and those are just never want to experience anything like that. So everybody, please be safe and share the road safely and be safe in the field. I know we're going to be pushing hard to try to get harvest wrapped up. We're going to be out in the field with anhydrous. There's just lots of things going on the farm, on the fall, out on the road or in the field that are potentially life-changing, life-altering, life-ending, unfortunately, things that we do in agriculture. So everybody be safe, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks.